From shepherd boy to giant slayer, from fugitive to king, from sinner to repentant servant. This is the epic story of David, the man after God's own heart. A teenager with 5 stones who toppled a giant. A king who danced before God's ark. A warrior who conquered nations. Yet his greatest victory was over his own failures. Why is David's story so crucial to the Bible? Because through David's lineage comes the Messiah, Jesus Christ himself. God's eternal covenant with David establishes the throne that will never end. David's Psalms give us words to worship, lament, and praise across every season of life. His story prophetically points to the ultimate king who would come from his bloodline. Every triumph and failure in David's life reveals God's grace, justice, and faithfulness. David shows us that God doesn't call the perfect. He perfects those he calls. This is more than history. It's prophecy fulfilled. King Saul had broken God's heart. The tall, handsome man, who once looked like the perfect king, had become stubborn and disobedient. He cared more about what people thought than what God wanted. The Lord had given him clear commands, but Saul chose his own way instead. Now God was done with him. In 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 1, God spoke to his faithful prophet Samuel with words that would change history forever. How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king. Samuel's hands must have trembled as he reached for his horn of oil. This was incredibly dangerous. If King Saul found out that Samuel was secretly anointing a new king, it would mean certain death for the old prophet. But God had thought of everything. He told Samuel to take a young cow with him and tell people he was going to Bethlehem to offer a sacrifice to the Lord. It was the perfect cover story. Samuel's heart was probably racing as he prepared for this secret mission. How do you anoint a new king when the old one is still alive and sitting on the throne? But God's ways are not our ways, and his timing is always perfect. The most important thing God told Samuel that day is found in verse 7. Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. This was a complete revolution in thinking. Everyone expected a king to be tall, strong, and impressive looking. But God was teaching Samuel that real leadership comes from the inside, not the outside. He wasn't looking for someone who looked like a king. He was looking for someone who had the heart of a king. When Samuel arrived in Bethlehem with his sacrifice, the town elders were nervous. Prophets didn't just show up for social visits. Usually when a man of God came to town, someone was in big trouble. But Samuel put their fears to rest and invited Jesse and his family to join him for the sacrifice. Jesse must have been proud as he gathered his sons. 7 strong, handsome young men lined up before the most famous prophet in Israel. Any father would be excited to have his boys stand before Samuel. Eliab stepped forward first. He was Jesse's oldest son, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that made people take notice. Samuel's heart jumped when he saw him. This had to be God's choice. He looked exactly like what a king should look like, but God's voice came clearly to Samuel's heart. No, not this one. Samuel was confused, but he trusted God's voice. Next came Abinadab, then Shammah, then each of the other sons. One by one, they passed in front of Samuel. One by one, God said no. Samuel stood there puzzled. 7 sons, and God had rejected them all. Finally, in verse 11, Samuel asked Jesse the question that would change everything. Are these all the sons you have? Jesse's answer broke Samuel's heart and revealed something sad about family relationships. There is still the youngest, Jesse said, almost like an afterthought. But he is tending the sheep. Can you imagine? His own father forgot about him. When it was time to meet the prophet of God, David wasn't even invited. He was out in the fields doing the job nobody else wanted to do. But Samuel knew God had a purpose in this. His words were firm and clear. "Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives." While they waited for David to come in from the fields, the tension in the room must have been thick. 7 impressive sons had been rejected. What could a shepherd boy possibly have that his older brothers didn't? The door swung open and everyone turned to look. In walked a young man with reddish skin, bright eyes, and dirt on his clothes from working in the fields. David had probably been wondering why his family suddenly needed him so urgently. Maybe he thought one of the sheep was sick or there was some emergency. He had no idea he was about to become the most important person in the room. The moment Samuel laid eyes on David, God's voice rang clear in his heart. "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." Imagine what happened next. 7 older brothers watched in complete shock as Samuel walked toward their little brother with the horn of oil in his hand. David probably didn't even understand what was happening. In those days, oil was used to set people apart for special service to God. Priests were anointed, kings were anointed, but David was just a shepherd boy. Samuel lifted the horn and poured the sacred oil over David's head. It ran down through his hair, down his face, marking him forever as God's chosen one. 1 Samuel 16:13 tells us what happened in that moment. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. This wasn't just a ceremony. This was the moment when God's own Spirit took up residence in David's life with incredible power. The forgotten son had become the chosen one. The shepherd boy had been marked as the future king. His brothers probably stood there with their mouths open, trying to understand how their baby brother had just been chosen over all of them. David's life would never be the same. From that day forward, the Spirit of God would guide him, strengthen him, and prepare him for the greatest throne in the nation. Sometimes God's biggest plans start with his most unlikely choices. The oil on David's head was God's way of saying, "This one belongs to me." While God's Spirit was filling David with power, something completely different was happening to King Saul. 1 Samuel 16:14 tells the tragic story. Now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. The man who had once been filled with God's Spirit was now empty and troubled. His moods became dark and unpredictable. One moment he would be fine, and the next he would be filled with rage or despair. His servants didn't know what to do with him. Finally, one of Saul's advisors came up with an idea. Music had always been known to calm troubled hearts and soothe angry spirits. In verse 16, they approached the king with their suggestion. "Let our Lord command his servants here to search for someone who can play the lyre. He will play when the evil spirit from God comes on you, and you will feel better." Saul thought this sounded like a good plan. Anything was worth trying if it might bring him some peace. One of the servants already had someone in mind. He told Saul about a young man from Bethlehem who was not only skilled with the harp, but was also brave in battle, wise in his speech, good-looking, and best of all, the Lord is with him. The servant was talking about David, though he had no idea that this young musician was actually God's chosen replacement for the very king he was trying to help. When David arrived at the palace with his harp, Saul welcomed him warmly. He had no clue that he was looking at the boy who would one day take his throne. All he knew was that when David played his music, the darkness lifted from his soul. Verse 23 describes what happened. Whenever the Spirit from God came on Saul, David would take up his lyre and play. Then relief would come to Saul. He would feel better, and the evil spirit would leave him. The future king was using his gift to heal the present king, and neither of them understood the irony of the situation. David's life became split between two completely different worlds. Part of the time, he lived in the royal palace, serving as Saul's personal armor-bearer and musician. He learned how a kingdom worked, watched important decisions being made, and saw the weight of leadership on Saul's shoulders. But the rest of the time, he was back home in Bethlehem, doing exactly what he had always done, taking care of his father's sheep in the hills and valleys around his hometown. 1 Samuel 17:15 explains David's unusual situation. But David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. This wasn't strange for that time period. Many servants worked part-time for the king while maintaining their family responsibilities. While David's three oldest brothers, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, had joined Saul's army as full-time soldiers, David continued to split his time between royal service and family duties. Each world taught David different lessons that would prove essential for his future. In the palace, he observed the complexities of ruling a nation. He saw how Saul handled disputes, made military decisions, and dealt with political pressure. He learned about the burden of leadership and the loneliness that comes with power. But out in the fields with his sheep, David learned equally important lessons. He fought off lions and bears that threatened his flock. He learned to lead and protect those under his care. He spent countless hours under the star-filled sky, composing songs of worship and having intimate conversations with God. This dual existence was God's perfect training program for the future king. The boy who could calm a troubled monarch with his music was the same boy who could kill a wild predator with his bare hands. The palace was teaching him about human leadership, while the pasture was teaching him about divine leadership. Both experiences were shaping the man after God's own heart. War clouds gathered over Israel once again. The Philistines, Israel's most persistent enemies, assembled their forces for battle and set up camp on a hill on the south side of the valley of Elah. King Saul quickly mobilized his army and established their position on the north side of the same valley. Two armies faced each other across the valley, each waiting for the other to make the first move. David's three oldest brothers were among Saul's soldiers, having enlisted in the king's army as career military men. But David was back home in Bethlehem, tending his father's flock as usual. Jesse, now an old man, was worried sick about his three sons at the battlefront. Days passed without any word from the war zone. In those times, there was no quick way to get news from distant places. Families just had to wait and worry when their loved ones went off to war. Finally, Jesse couldn't stand the uncertainty any longer. In 1 Samuel 17:17-18, he called David and gave him an important mission. Take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are and bring back some assurance from them. This was more than just a food delivery. Jesse needed to know if his boys were safe, and David was the only son available to make the dangerous journey to the war zone. David probably thought this would be a routine trip. Load up the donkey with supplies, travel to where the army was camped, find his brothers, deliver the food, get a report on how they were doing, and head back home with news for his worried father. He had no way of knowing that this simple act of family loyalty was about to thrust him into the most famous battle in history. Sometimes God uses the most ordinary errands to set up his most extraordinary miracles. When David reached the army camp, he discovered that something terrible had been happening for weeks. Instead of fighting, both armies had been locked in a bizarre standoff. The reason was a giant Philistine warrior named Goliath, who had been making the same challenge every single day for 40 days straight. 1 Samuel 17:4 describes this terrifying enemy. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. That means he was over 9 feet tall, a true giant among men. Goliath wasn't just big, he was a walking weapon. His bronze helmet gleamed in the sunlight. His body armor was made of bronze scales and weighed 125 pounds. Bronze shin guards protected his legs. Between his shoulders hung a bronze javelin. His spear was as thick as a weaver's beam, and its iron point alone weighed 15 pounds. A shield-bearer walked in front of him, carrying a shield so large it could protect the giant's entire body. Just looking at Goliath was enough to make grown men tremble with fear. But the giant's most devastating weapon wasn't his size or his armor. It was his voice. Twice every day, morning and evening, for 40 days, Goliath had been shouting the same challenge across the valley. In verses 8 to 9, his words rang out like thunder. "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." The giant's challenge was simple, but devastating. Instead of having 2 entire armies fight and thousands of men die, let one warrior from each side fight to the death. Winner takes all. The losing army becomes slaves to the winning army. It should have been an easy decision for God's people. But there was one problem. Not a single man in Israel's army had the courage to face Goliath. For 40 days, God's people had been humiliated twice a day by one man's voice. David arrived at the camp just as the Israelite army was moving into their battle positions for another day of doing nothing. He quickly found the supply keeper and left his father's provisions, then ran toward the battle line to find his brothers and see what was happening. That's when he heard it for the first time. Goliath's booming voice echoing across the valley of Elah with the same insulting challenge he had been making twice a day for over a month. What David saw next shocked him to his core. In verse 24, Scripture records the shameful scene. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. These were supposed to be God's mighty warriors, the army of the living God, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But they were running away like frightened children from the voice of one man. David couldn't believe his eyes. The young shepherd's heart began to burn with righteous anger. This wasn't just about military strategy or battle tactics. This was about the honor of God himself. In verse 26, David began asking the soldiers around him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" David was seeing something that all these experienced warriors had missed. Every day that Goliath went unchallenged was another day that God's name was being dragged through the mud. The other soldiers told David about the reward King Saul had offered: great riches, marriage to the king's daughter, and tax-free status for the winner's entire family. But David wasn't thinking about rewards. He was thinking about the God he had spent countless hours worshiping under the stars while tending sheep. The same God who had helped him kill lions and bears was being mocked by an enemy, and nobody seemed to care enough to do anything about it. While grown men cowered in their tents, a teenager's faith was rising to defend the honor of the Almighty God. David's questions about rewards for killing Goliath reached the wrong ears. His oldest brother Eliab overheard him talking to the soldiers and exploded with anger. Eliab accused David of being conceited and wicked, asking why he had left the sheep just to come watch the battle. But David's simple response in 1 Samuel 17:29 revealed his heart. "Now what have I done? Can't I even speak?" He wasn't looking for glory or trying to show off. He genuinely couldn't understand why everyone was so afraid of one man who was insulting their God. Word of David's bold questions eventually reached King Saul himself. The king summoned this young shepherd who was asking dangerous questions about fighting the giant. When David stood before Saul, he didn't hesitate to volunteer. In verse 32, David declared, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul looked at this teenager and immediately pointed out the obvious problem. "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David had an answer that would change everything. He began telling Saul about his life as a shepherd, and the stories he shared revealed a faith that burned like fire. In verses 34 to 36, David explained, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God." David wasn't bragging about his own strength. He was bragging about God's faithfulness. Then he said the words that would echo through history. "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." This wasn't wishful thinking or youthful arrogance. This was mature faith speaking from years of experience with God's power. David had learned in the quiet pastures what Israel's army had forgotten on the noisy battlefield, that God fights for his people. King Saul was amazed by David's faith, but he still worried about sending a boy to fight a giant. If David was determined to go, at least he could give him proper protection. Saul dressed David in his own royal armor, complete with a bronze helmet and a coat of mail. He gave David his own sword to carry into battle. For a moment, it must have seemed like David was ready to face Goliath as a properly equipped warrior. But there was a problem. David tried to walk in Saul's armor and immediately knew it wouldn't work. He had never worn heavy armor before, and it was probably too big for him anyway. In 1 Samuel 17:39, David told Saul, "I cannot go in these because I am not used to them." So David took off all the armor and handed back the sword. He would face the giant exactly as he was, a shepherd boy with simple weapons. David walked down to the valley stream and carefully chose 5 smooth stones. He put them in his shepherd's bag and picked up his sling, the same simple weapon he had used countless times to protect sheep from predators. This wasn't the equipment of a warrior. It was the toolkit of a shepherd. But David knew that God had used these simple tools before, and God would use them again. As David walked toward the valley of Elah, where Goliath waited, the giant saw him coming and was insulted. In verse 43, Goliath shouted, "Am I a dog, that you come at me with sticks?" The giant cursed David by his gods and threatened to feed his flesh to the birds and wild animals. But David's response in verses 45 to 47 rang across the valley with absolute confidence. "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." Then David did something that shocked everyone watching. Instead of approaching cautiously like a careful warrior, he ran straight toward the giant. As he ran, he reached into his bag, pulled out a stone, put it in his sling, and let it fly with deadly accuracy. The stone flew through the air with perfect aim. It struck Goliath right in the forehead, the one spot not covered by his bronze armor. The giant, who had terrorized 2 armies for 40 days, fell face down on the ground like a toppled tree. 1 Samuel 17:49 describes the moment. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. But David wasn't finished. He ran to where Goliath lay and stood over the fallen giant. Since David had no sword of his own, he pulled Goliath's massive sword from its sheath and used it to cut off the giant's head. The symbolism was perfect. The weapon that was supposed to kill David became the instrument of Goliath's final defeat. The effect on both armies was immediate and dramatic. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, panic swept through their ranks. These battle-hardened warriors turned and fled in terror. The men of Israel and Judah, who had been cowering in fear just moments before, suddenly found their courage and chased after their enemies with loud war cries. They pursued the Philistines all the way to the gates of Ekron, and the road was littered with the bodies of fleeing Philistines. After the battle, David picked up Goliath's head and carried it to Jerusalem. He also took the giant's weapons and kept them as trophies of God's victory. Word of what happened spread like wildfire throughout Israel. The shepherd boy who had been forgotten by his own father just weeks before was now the most famous person in the nation. But David's victory meant much more than just winning a battle. It proved to everyone that the God of Israel was still the same God who had parted the Red Sea and brought down the walls of Jericho. When his people trust him completely, nothing is impossible. The victory also marked a turning point in David's life. He would never again be just a simple shepherd boy. From this moment forward, he would be known as the giant killer, the warrior who trusted God when everyone else was afraid. But with fame would come new challenges that David couldn't possibly imagine. After David's incredible victory over Goliath, King Saul brought him into the palace for a long conversation. Saul wanted to know everything about this remarkable young man who had just saved Israel from disaster. But someone else in the palace was even more impressed with David than the king was. Jonathan, Saul's oldest son and the heir to the throne, had watched the entire battle and was amazed by David's courage and faith. 1 Samuel 18:1 tells us something beautiful happened that day. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. This wasn't just admiration or respect. This was the beginning of one of the most famous friendships in history. Jonathan, who could have seen David as a threat to his own future as king, instead saw him as a brother. Jonathan did something that showed just how much he valued David's friendship. In verse 4, Scripture records an amazing act of love. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic, and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. This wasn't just gift-giving. In that culture, giving someone your robe and weapons was a way of saying they had equal status with you. Jonathan, the prince of Israel, was treating David, a shepherd's son, as his equal. But Jonathan went even further. He made a covenant with David, a sacred promise that would bind them together for life. This covenant meant that Jonathan was pledging his loyalty to David no matter what happened. He was promising to be David's friend, even if it cost him everything. Jonathan somehow understood that God had chosen David for something special, and he was willing to step aside and support God's plan, even though it might mean giving up his own right to be king. This friendship would be tested in ways that neither young man could imagine. In the years ahead, Jonathan would have to choose between loyalty to his father and loyalty to his friend. But the covenant they made that day would prove stronger than family ties, stronger than politics, and stronger than the threat of death itself. David's victory over Goliath was just the beginning of his military success. King Saul kept David close to the palace and began sending him on various military missions against Israel's enemies. Whatever Saul asked David to do, he did it successfully. 1 Samuel 18:5 tells us that David was successful in everything Saul sent him to do, so Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This pleased all the troops and Saul's officers as well. David quickly became the most popular military leader in Israel. Soldiers loved serving under him because he always led them to victory. Officers respected him because he was wise in battle and cared about his men. Even King Saul was pleased with David's performance, at least at first. It seemed like everything was going perfectly for the young hero. But then something happened that changed everything. After a particularly successful military campaign, the army was returning home in triumph. As they approached the cities of Israel, something wonderful and terrible occurred. The women came out to welcome the victorious warriors with singing and dancing, as was the custom after military victories. They played tambourines and other instruments and sang songs celebrating the victory. But the song they sang in 1 Samuel 18:7 lit a fire of jealousy in King Saul's heart that would never be put out. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. The women meant it as a compliment to both men. They were celebrating both the king and his young commander. But Saul didn't hear it that way. Verse 8 tells us exactly how Saul reacted. Saul was very angry. This refrain displeased him greatly. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? From that day forward, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. The singing that was meant to honor the king became the beginning of a deadly obsession that would drive Saul to madness and eventually destroy him. The women's innocent song of praise had revealed a truth that Saul couldn't handle. David was becoming more popular than the king himself. In Saul's mind, there was only one explanation for David's success, and it terrified him. David must be planning to take his throne. The day after the women sang their song comparing David to Saul, something evil happened in the palace. 1 Samuel 18:10 describes a terrifying scene. The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully on Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the lyre, as he usually did. This wasn't the gentle melancholy that David's music normally healed. This was something much darker and more dangerous. As David sat playing his harp, trying to soothe the king's troubled spirit, as he had done so many times before, Saul suddenly grabbed a spear. Without warning, he hurled it at David with deadly intent. Verse 11 tells us that Saul hurled it, saying to himself, "I'll pin David to the wall." But David eluded him twice. David had to dodge for his life, not once but twice, as the king he served tried to murder him in cold blood. Saul's failed attempts to kill David only made him more afraid. He realized that God was protecting David, and this terrified him even more. In verse 12, we read that Saul was afraid of David, because the Lord was with David, but had departed from Saul. The king knew he was fighting against God himself, but his jealousy had driven him past the point of caring about right and wrong. Saul decided to get David out of the palace, where he couldn't keep a close eye on him. But he was clever about it. Instead of just sending David away, he promoted him. Saul made David a commander over 1,000 men and sent him out on dangerous military missions. His secret hope was that David would be killed in battle by Israel's enemies. But this plan backfired completely. Verses 14 to 16 tell us what happened. In everything he did, he had great success, because the Lord was with him. When Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. Instead of getting David killed, Saul's plan only made David more popular and more successful. The harder Saul tried to destroy David, the more obvious it became that God was blessing him. Saul's paranoia was eating him alive, but he couldn't stop himself. Every victory David won, every cheer from the crowds, every sign of God's blessing on David's life only made Saul more desperate to get rid of him. The king was trapped in a prison of his own jealousy, and it was driving him insane. When Saul's attempts to have David killed in battle failed, the king came up with a new plan that was even more devious. He decided to use his own daughters as bait to trap David. First, Saul offered his older daughter Merab to David as a wife. In 1 Samuel 18:17, Saul said, "Here is my older daughter Merab. I will give her to you in marriage. Only serve me bravely and fight the battles of the Lord." But Saul's real thoughts were much darker. "I will not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines do that." David was humble in his response, asking how a poor shepherd's son could become the king's son-in-law. But when the time came for the wedding, Saul gave Merab to another man instead. This public humiliation was probably part of Saul's plan to hurt and anger David. But Saul had another daughter, and she gave him an even better opportunity for his scheme. Michal, Saul's younger daughter, had fallen in love with David. When Saul heard about this, he was pleased because it gave him a new way to trap David. In verse 21, Saul thought to himself, "I will give her to him, so that she may be a snare to him, and so that the hand of the Philistines may be against him." Saul's servants went to David and told him that the king wanted him as a son-in-law. But when they mentioned marriage, David again protested that he was too poor to marry a princess. In verse 23, David said, "Do you think it is a small matter to become the king's son-in-law? I'm only a poor man and little known." This was exactly what Saul had hoped to hear. He sent word back to David with his price for Michal's hand in marriage. In verse 25, Saul's message was, "Say to David, the king wants no other price for the bride than 100 Philistine foreskins to take revenge on his enemies." This was a death sentence disguised as a bride price. Saul was sure that David would be killed trying to collect such grisly trophies from Israel's fiercest enemies. But once again, Saul had underestimated both David's courage and God's protection. David and his men went out and killed not just 100 Philistines, but 200. He brought back proof of his victory and presented it to Saul. The king had no choice but to keep his word and give Michal to David as his wife. In verse 28, we see the result of Saul's failed scheme. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became still more afraid of David, and he remained his enemy the rest of his days. Instead of destroying David, Saul's plan had only made David stronger and more connected to the royal family. Saul's hatred for David had grown into a murderous obsession that he could no longer hide. In 1 Samuel 19:1, we read that Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David. The king had given up all pretense and was now openly calling for David's assassination. But Jonathan, David's covenant friend, couldn't bear the thought of his beloved friend being murdered. Jonathan warned David to be careful, and then went to his father to try to change his mind. In verses 4 to 5, Jonathan pleaded with Saul, "Let not the king do wrong to his servant David. He has not wronged you, and what he has done has benefited you greatly. He took his life in his hands when he killed the Philistine. The Lord won a great victory for all Israel, and you saw it and were glad. Why then would you do wrong to an innocent man like David by killing him for no reason?" For a moment, it seemed like Jonathan's words had gotten through to his father. Saul took an oath, saying, "As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death." David returned to the palace and served Saul as before, even playing his harp to soothe the king's troubled spirit. But the peace didn't last long. When war broke out again with the Philistines, David led Israel to another great victory. But success only made Saul more jealous. Once again, as David played his harp in the palace, an evil spirit came upon Saul. In verse 10, we read that Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear, but David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall. That night, David made good his escape. Saul wasn't finished. He sent soldiers to David's house to watch it all night and kill David in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, discovered the plot. She warned David that if he didn't escape that night, he would be dead by morning. In verses 12 to 13, Michal helped David escape through a window and then put an idol in their bed with goat's hair at the head to make it look like David was sleeping there. When Saul's men came looking for David the next morning, Michal told them he was sick in bed. But when they looked closer and found the dummy, they reported back to Saul. The king was furious with his daughter for helping David escape, but it was too late. David was gone. That night, as David climbed out of his bedroom window and disappeared into the darkness, his life as a fugitive began. The shepherd boy who had become a giant killer, who had won the love of a nation and married a princess, was now running for his life from the very king he had served so faithfully. He had no way of knowing that this was just the beginning of years of hiding, danger, and heartbreak that would ultimately prepare him for God's greatest plan for his life. After escaping from Saul through his bedroom window, David was now a man on the run with nowhere safe to go. He first fled to Samuel in Ramah, hoping the old prophet could give him advice and protection. But even there, Saul's men tracked him down. David had to keep moving, and he eventually made his way to a place that would become famous in his story: the Cave of Adullam. This wasn't just any hiding place. The Cave of Adullam was a large limestone cave in the hills of Judah, big enough to shelter many people. When David's family heard where he was hiding, they came to join him. His father Jesse, his mother, and all his brothers left their home in Bethlehem to be with David in his time of trouble. But they weren't the only ones who came. Word spread quickly that David was hiding in the cave, and something amazing began to happen. In 1 Samuel 22:2, Scripture tells us about the kind of people who started gathering around David. All those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him, and he became their leader. About 400 men were with him. These weren't the cream of society. They weren't wealthy merchants or respected leaders. They were the forgotten ones, men who had been crushed by life's hardships, who owed money they couldn't pay, who felt like the world had left them behind. Some were probably running from creditors. Others might have been fleeing from unfair treatment by corrupt officials. Many were simply men who had lost hope and needed someone to believe in. But David saw something in these broken men that others missed. He didn't turn them away because they weren't perfect. Instead, he welcomed them and began to mold them into something extraordinary. Under David's leadership, these 400 outcasts became a band of loyal warriors who would follow him anywhere. They called him their captain, and they would prove their devotion to him in the years ahead. David's ability to inspire loyalty in desperate men revealed something important about his character. He understood what it felt like to be an outcast because he had been overlooked by his own family. He knew what it meant to be hunted and hated because he was living it every day. These men found in David not just a leader, but someone who truly understood their pain and gave them a reason to hope again. David's time in the wilderness was filled with close calls and narrow escapes from Saul's relentless pursuit. The king had become obsessed with capturing David, using thousands of soldiers to hunt down one man and his band of followers. But twice during this dark period, God put Saul's life directly into David's hands, and both times David's response revealed the true condition of his heart. The first opportunity came when Saul was chasing David in the region around En-Gedi, near the Dead Sea. Saul took 3,000 of his best soldiers to hunt for David in the rocky wilderness. During the search, nature called, and Saul went into a cave to relieve himself. He had no idea that David and his men were hiding in the depths of that very same cave. David's men were excited. They whispered to David that this was obviously God delivering his enemy into his hands. They urged him to kill Saul and end all their troubles. Instead, David quietly crept forward and carefully cut off a corner of Saul's robe without the king knowing it. But even this small act of taking something that belonged to the king made David's heart troubled. 1 Samuel 24:5 tells us, "Afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. When Saul left the cave, David followed him and called out, 'My lord the king.' Saul was shocked to see David standing behind him, holding the piece of cloth. In verses 9 to 11, David said, 'Why do you listen when men say, David is bent on harming you? This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lay my hand on my Lord, because he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, look at this piece of your robe in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but did not kill you.' The second opportunity came later when Saul was again pursuing David with an army. This time, David and one of his men, Abishai, snuck into Saul's camp at night while everyone was sleeping. They found Saul sleeping in the center of the camp with his spear stuck in the ground near his head. Abishai begged David to let him kill Saul with one thrust of the spear, but David refused. In 1 Samuel 26:9-11, David said, 'Don't destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? As surely as the Lord lives, the Lord himself will strike him, or his time will come, and he will die, or he will go into battle and perish. But the Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed.' Instead of killing Saul, David took the king's spear and water jug and left the camp. From a safe distance, he called out and woke everyone up, showing them the items he had taken as proof that he could have killed Saul, but chose not to. Both times, Saul was moved to tears by David's mercy and temporarily stopped his pursuit, though his jealousy always eventually drove him to continue the hunt. During his time in the wilderness, David and his men often protected local shepherds and farmers from bandits and wild animals. They expected nothing in return except basic hospitality and perhaps some food when supplies ran low. This protection was especially important during sheep shearing time, when there was celebration and plenty of food to share. David heard that a wealthy man named Nabal was shearing his sheep near the town of Carmel. David's men had been protecting Nabal's shepherds and flocks for months without taking anything or causing any trouble. So David sent 10 young men to Nabal with a polite request for food, reminding him of the protection they had provided. But Nabal's response was shockingly rude and insulting. In 1 Samuel 25:10-11, he said to David's messengers, "Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse?" Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I take my bread and water, and the meat I have slaughtered for my shearers, and give it to men coming from who knows where? When David heard about Nabal's insult, he was furious. He told 400 of his men to strap on their swords and prepare for battle. He was determined to kill Nabal and every man in his household for this disrespectful treatment. David's anger was understandable, but it was about to lead him into a terrible mistake that would have haunted him for the rest of his life. Fortunately, one of Nabal's servants ran to tell Nabal's wife Abigail what had happened. Abigail was as wise and beautiful as her husband was foolish and harsh. She immediately understood the danger and took quick action to prevent disaster. Without telling her husband, she loaded donkeys with bread, wine, roasted grain, raisins, and figs, and hurried out to meet David. When Abigail saw David, she fell at his feet and took full responsibility for her husband's behavior. In verses 24-26, she said, "Pardon your servant, my lord, and let me speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say. Please pay no attention, my lord, to that wicked man Nabal. He is just like his name. His name means fool, and folly goes with him. And now, my lord, as surely as the Lord your God lives and as you live, since the Lord has kept you from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands, may your enemies and all who are intent on harming my lord be like Nabal." Abigail's wise words stopped David from making a huge mistake. She reminded him that God had kept him from shedding innocent blood, and that he would one day be king of Israel. She helped him see that taking revenge on Nabal would only hurt his own reputation and go against God's will for his life. David was so impressed by Abigail's wisdom that he praised God for sending her to stop him. 10 days later, when Nabal died of what appears to have been a heart attack or stroke, David asked Abigail to become his wife, and she accepted. David's life as a fugitive was becoming unbearable. No matter where he hid in Israel, Saul's spies would eventually find him and report his location to the king. David was tired of constantly running, tired of putting his men in danger, and tired of living in caves and wilderness strongholds. He needed a place where Saul couldn't reach him, even if it meant doing something that seemed impossible. David made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He decided to seek refuge with the Philistines, Israel's greatest enemies. This was the same people whose champion, Goliath, David had killed years earlier. It was an incredibly risky move, but David was desperate for a safe place where Saul wouldn't dare to follow. David chose to go to King Achish of Gath, the same city where Goliath had come from. He brought with him 600 men and all their families. In 1 Samuel 27:2-3, we read, "So David and the 600 men with him left and went over to Achish son of Maok, king of Gath. David and his men settled in Gath with Achish. Each man had his family with him, and David had his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, the widow of Nabal." At first, King Achish welcomed David because he thought David had become an enemy of Israel, just like the Philistines were. David was famous for his military skills, and having him as an ally would be a great advantage. But living in Gath created problems for David. The city was too close to Israel, and people remembered him as the one who had killed their greatest warrior. David wisely asked Achish for a different arrangement. In verse 5, David said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be assigned to me in one of the country towns, that I may live there. Why should your servant live in the royal city with you?" Achish agreed and gave David the town of Ziklag, which became David's base of operations. Living in Ziklag solved several problems for David. His men were safe from Saul's attacks. They had a permanent place to live with their families, and David could operate without the Philistines watching his every move. But this arrangement also created a difficult situation. Achish expected David to fight against Israel, which David could never do. David handled this problem very carefully. He would take his men on raids, but instead of attacking Israelite towns, he would attack Israel's enemies, the Geshurites, Girzites, and Amalekites. When Achish asked about these raids, David would give answers that made it sound like he was attacking Israelite settlements. 1 Samuel 27:10 tells us that when Achish asked, "Where did you go raiding today?" David would say, "Against the Negev of Judah," or "Against the Negev of Jerahmeel," or "Against the Negev of the Kenites." David made sure that no one from these enemy tribes survived to report what really happened. This way, Achish believed that David was becoming more and more hated by his own people, making him more valuable as a Philistine ally. For 16 months, David successfully played this dangerous game, protecting his men while avoiding any real betrayal of Israel. While David was living among the Philistines, King Saul's situation was getting worse and worse. The evil spirit that tormented him was becoming stronger, and his paranoia was destroying his ability to rule effectively. But the worst news came when the Philistines assembled a massive army for what would be their final invasion of Israel. When Saul saw the enormous Philistine army gathered at Shunem, terror filled his heart. This wasn't just another border raid or small conflict. This was a full-scale invasion that threatened to destroy Israel completely. Saul desperately needed guidance from God, but when he tried to seek God's will, something terrible happened. Nothing. 1 Samuel 28:6 tells us, "He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him by dreams or Urim or prophets." The silence from heaven was deafening and terrifying. God had completely cut off communication with Saul because of his disobedience and rebellion. Samuel the prophet was dead, so Saul couldn't turn to him for advice. The other prophets wouldn't speak to Saul because they knew God had rejected him. Saul was facing the greatest crisis of his reign with no divine guidance whatsoever. In his desperation, Saul decided to do something that went against everything he had once stood for. Earlier in his reign, he had obeyed God's law by removing all the mediums and fortune tellers from Israel. But now he wanted to find one of these forbidden practitioners and use them to contact the dead prophet Samuel. Saul disguised himself and traveled by night to the town of Endor, where his servants had found a woman who practiced witchcraft. When he arrived at her house, the woman was suspicious because she knew that King Saul had made her profession illegal and punishable by death. But Saul promised her that no harm would come to her, and he asked her to bring up Samuel from the dead. What happened next terrified everyone present. When the woman performed her ritual, she suddenly cried out in fear. She had expected to produce some kind of fake spirit or demonic impersonation, but instead, God allowed the real Samuel to appear. In verse 12, when the woman saw Samuel, she cried out at the top of her voice and said to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." Samuel's spirit was not happy to be disturbed. In verses 15 to 16, Samuel said to Saul, "Why do you consult me, now that the Lord has departed from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done what he predicted through me. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands and given it to one of your neighbors, to David." Then Samuel delivered the most terrifying prophecy of Saul's life. In verses 18 to 19, the dead prophet said, "Because you did not obey the Lord or carry out his fierce wrath against the Amalekites, The Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will deliver both Israel and you into the hands of the Philistines. And tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also give the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines." Saul collapsed on the ground in terror. Tomorrow he would die, along with his sons, and Israel would be defeated. The witch of Endor had given him the guidance he sought, but it was not the comfort he had hoped to find. The next day dawned gray and grim as the two armies prepared for battle on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines had assembled their largest force ever, confident that this would be the day they would finally crush Israel completely. On the Israelite side, Saul and his army took their positions. But the king's heart was heavy with the knowledge of what Samuel's spirit had told him the night before. The battle began at dawn, and from the very first clash of weapons, everything went wrong for Israel. The Philistines had better weapons, better tactics, and most importantly, God was not fighting for Israel as he had in previous battles. The Israelite army began to crumble under the fierce Philistine attack. 1 Samuel 31. The 1-2 describes the disaster. Now the Philistines fought against Israel. The Israelites fled before them, and many fell dead on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines were in hot pursuit of Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. Jonathan, David's beloved friend, died fighting bravely alongside his father. The prince who had made a covenant of friendship with David and had protected him from Saul's murderous rage was gone. Also killed were Saul's other sons, Abinadab and Malchishua. In a few terrible hours, an entire generation of Israel's royal family was wiped out. The Philistines pressed their attack, focusing especially on capturing King Saul alive. They wanted to parade him as a trophy and humiliate him before executing him publicly. But Saul was badly wounded by arrows and knew he couldn't escape. Seeing the enemy closing in, Saul made a desperate request to his armor-bearer in verse 4. "Draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me." But the armor-bearer was too terrified to kill his own king, even though Saul was begging him to do it. So Saul took matters into his own hands. He took his own sword, set it upright on the ground, and fell on it, ending his own life rather than being captured alive by his enemies. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died beside his king. The man who had once been anointed by God to lead Israel, who had started his reign with such promise and hope, died alone on a battlefield, defeated by his enemies and abandoned by God. The Philistines found Saul's body the next day and did exactly what he had feared they would do. They cut off his head, stripped off his armor, and hung his body on the wall of the city of Beth-shan as a trophy of their victory. They also hung the bodies of his 3 sons beside him. It was a humiliating end for the first king of Israel. David was far away from the battle when Saul and Jonathan died. He was still living in Ziklag with the Philistines, completely unaware that his greatest enemy and his dearest friend had both perished on the same terrible day. The news came to him in a way that would test his character once again. On the 3rd day after the battle, a young man arrived at Ziklag with his clothes torn and dirt on his head, the traditional signs of mourning and bad news. He claimed to be an Amalekite who had escaped from the battlefield, and he had a story to tell that he thought would make David happy. The young man told David that he had found King Saul wounded and dying on the battlefield. According to his story, Saul had begged him to end his suffering. So he had killed the king and taken his crown and bracelet to bring to David as proof. The Amalekite expected to be rewarded for killing David's enemy, but he had completely misunderstood David's heart. Instead of celebrating, David was horrified. In 2 Samuel 1:14, David demanded, "Why were you not afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Whether the young man's story was true, or whether he had simply found Saul's body and taken the crown hoping for a reward, David saw his action as a terrible crime against God's chosen king. David ordered one of his men to execute the Amalekite for claiming to have killed Saul. Then David did something that revealed the true nobility of his character. Instead of celebrating his enemy's death, he composed one of the most beautiful songs of mourning ever written. The song is called "The Song of the Bow" and is recorded in 2 Samuel 1:19-27. David began with these heartbroken words. "A gazelle lies slain on your heights, Israel. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath. Proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines be glad, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised rejoice." David didn't want Israel's enemies to celebrate this victory. He mourned for Saul despite all the years of persecution and attempted murder. But his deepest grief was for Jonathan. In verses 25-26, David cried out, "How the mighty have fallen in battle! Jonathan lies slain on your heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women." David commanded that this song be taught to all the people of Judah so they would remember and honor both Saul and Jonathan. He refused to allow anyone to speak evil of the dead king or to celebrate his death. Even in death, David showed respect for the man who had tried so hard to kill him. With Saul dead and his sons killed in battle, the throne of Israel was empty. David knew that God had promised to make him king, but he also knew that God's timing was not always the same as human timing. Instead of rushing to claim the crown, David did what he always did in important moments. He asked God for guidance. 1 Samuel 2:1 tells us that David inquired of the Lord. "Shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah?" he asked. The Lord said, "Go up." David asked, "Where shall I go?" "To Hebron," the Lord answered. God's direction was clear. David was to go to Hebron, the ancient city where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were buried, and begin his reign there. David left Ziklag with his 600 men and all their families. When they arrived in Hebron, the leaders of the tribe of Judah were waiting for them. They had heard about Saul's death and knew that David was God's chosen replacement. Without hesitation, they anointed David as king over the tribe of Judah. But David's kingdom was far from complete. Saul's army commander, Abner, had taken Saul's surviving son, Ishbosheth, and made him king over the northern tribes of Israel. This meant that the nation was now divided into two kingdoms, David ruling over Judah in the south, and Ishbosheth ruling over Israel in the north. The situation was complicated and dangerous. Many people in the northern tribes didn't know David well and weren't sure they wanted him as their king. They remembered him as the young man who had killed Goliath, but they also knew he had been living with the Philistines. Some wondered if he could be trusted. David established his capital in Hebron and began the difficult work of ruling his portion of the kingdom. He had to prove himself as more than just a warrior. He had to show that he could govern wisely, make fair decisions, and bring prosperity to his people. He also had to be patient, knowing that God would eventually give him the rest of Israel in his perfect timing. For 7.5 years, David ruled over Judah from Hebron, while civil war continued with the northern kingdom. It was a time of testing and preparation, as God continued to shape the shepherd boy into the man who would become the greatest king in Israel's history. The boy who had been forgotten by his own family was now king over one of the 12 tribes. But this was still just the beginning of God's plan for his life. The civil war between David's kingdom in Judah and Ishbosheth's kingdom in the northern tribes dragged on for years. But gradually, David's side grew stronger, while Ishbosheth's grew weaker. The turning point came when Abner, the commander of Ishbosheth's army and the real power behind his throne, had a falling out with the king he had helped create. The conflict started over something that seemed small, but carried huge meaning in that culture. Ishbosheth accused Abner of sleeping with one of Saul's former wives, a woman named Rizpah. In ancient times, taking a king's wife or concubine was seen as a claim to the throne itself. Whether the accusation was true or not, Abner was furious at being questioned by the weak king he had been propping up. In 2 Samuel 3:8, Abner exploded with anger. "Am I a dog's head on Judah's side? This very day I am loyal to the house of Saul your father, to his family and friends. I haven't handed you over to David. Yet now you accuse me of an offense involving this woman." Abner was done with Ishbosheth and ready to switch sides. Abner sent messengers to David with a stunning offer. He would bring all of northern Israel over to David's side. But David had one condition before he would make any deal with Abner. In verse 13, David's message was clear. "Good, I will make an agreement with you. But I demand one thing of you. Do not come into my presence unless you bring Michal, daughter of Saul, when you come to see me." Michal was David's first wife, the one who had helped him escape from Saul years earlier. After David fled, Saul had given her to another man named Paltiel. But David wanted her back, not just because he loved her, but because marrying into Saul's family would strengthen his claim to rule all of Israel. Abner forced Ishbosheth to take Michal away from Paltiel and return her to David. The Bible tells us that Paltiel followed them weeping, showing how much he loved the woman who was being taken from him. But political necessity was more important than personal feelings. When Abner came to Hebron with 20 men and brought Michal to David, he also brought something even more valuable, a promise. He told David that he would convince all the elders of Israel to accept David as their king. After meeting with David, Abner began traveling throughout the northern tribes, persuading the leaders that it was time to unite under David's rule. But Abner's plan was cut short by an act of personal revenge. When Joab, David's military commander, heard that Abner had visited David and left safely, he was furious. Joab's brother, Asahel, had been killed by Abner during the civil war, and Joab wanted blood revenge. Without telling David, Joab tricked Abner into coming back and murdered him. David was heartbroken when he heard what Joab had done. He publicly mourned for Abner and cursed Joab for his treachery. But Abner's death actually helped David's cause. When Ishbosheth heard that his strongest supporter was dead, he lost all courage. Soon after, 2 of his own officers murdered Ishbosheth in his bed and brought his head to David, thinking they would be rewarded. Instead, David was horrified. Just as he had executed the man who claimed to kill Saul, David ordered these murderers to be killed for assassinating Ishbosheth. He gave Ishbosheth an honorable burial, showing once again that he would not benefit from the murder of his enemies. With both Abner and Ishbosheth dead, the northern tribes had no choice but to accept David as their king. In 2 Samuel 5:1-3, representatives from all the tribes came to David at Hebron and said, "We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, 'You will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler.'" They anointed David as king over all Israel, finally fulfilling God's promise from years earlier. Now that David was king over all 12 tribes, he needed a capital city that would unite the nation. Hebron had served well as the capital of Judah, but it was too far south to be the center of a united kingdom. David also couldn't choose a city that belonged to one of the northern tribes, because that might make the other tribes jealous. David had his eye on a perfect solution, the city of Jerusalem. This ancient city sat right on the border between the tribal lands of Judah and Benjamin, making it neutral territory that belonged to no particular tribe. But there was one major problem. Jerusalem was still controlled by the Jebusites, a Canaanite people who had never been conquered by the Israelites. The Jebusites were so confident in their city's defenses that they mocked David when he came to attack them. The city was built on a high hill surrounded by deep valleys on 3 sides, with massive walls and strong fortifications. In 2 Samuel 5:6, the Jebusites taunted David, saying, "You will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off." But David was determined to take this strategic city. He offered a special reward to whoever could find a way to break through Jerusalem's defenses. The key to victory came when someone discovered a water shaft that led up into the city from the spring outside the walls. David's men climbed up through this tunnel and attacked the Jebusites from inside their own city. The conquest was swift and complete. In verse 7, Scripture records, "David captured the fortress of Zion, which is the city of David." The shepherd boy who had once been forgotten by his own family now owned the most strategic city in all of Canaan. David immediately began transforming Jerusalem into a capital worthy of God's chosen nation. He built up the area around the fortress and expanded the city's defenses. He constructed a palace for himself and brought his government officials to live in the new capital. Most importantly, he renamed part of the city of David, making it forever associated with his name and reign. The choice of Jerusalem was brilliant in every way. It was centrally located so people from all tribes could reach it easily. It was militarily strong, sitting high on a hill with natural defenses. It was politically neutral, belonging to no tribe but to the king himself. And it would soon become the spiritual center of Israel as well, when David brought the Ark of the Covenant there. Jerusalem quickly became more than just David's capital. It became the heart of the entire nation. Merchants came there to trade, pilgrims came there to worship, and leaders came there to seek the king's wisdom. What had once been a Jebusite fortress became the most important city in Israel's history. David's conquest of Jerusalem also sent a clear message to all of Israel's enemies. If the king could capture a city as strong as Jerusalem, he could conquer anyone who opposed him. The victory established David's reputation as a military genius and showed that God was truly with him in everything he did. With Jerusalem established as his capital, David turned his attention to something even more important than politics or military strategy. The Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred object in all of Israel, had been sitting in the house of a man named Abinadab in Kiriath Jearim for many years. David knew that Israel's spiritual center needed to be in the same place as its political center. David gathered 30,000 chosen men from all over Israel for this special mission. This wasn't just a military operation. It was a religious celebration that would unite the entire nation around their shared faith in God. The Ark represented God's presence among his people, and bringing it to Jerusalem would make the city truly holy. The men carefully placed the Ark on a new cart pulled by oxen, just as the Philistines had done years earlier when they returned it to Israel. Abinadab's sons, Uzzah and Ahio, guided the cart while David and all the people celebrated with music and dancing. In 2 Samuel 6:5, the Bible tells us they were celebrating with all their might before the Lord, with castanets, harps, lyres, timbrels, sistrums, and cymbals. But the celebration was suddenly interrupted by tragedy. When the oxen stumbled and the ark began to slide off the cart, Uzzah reached out to steady it with his hand. The moment he touched the ark, God struck him dead. David was shocked and frightened by what had happened. He was so upset that he refused to take the ark any further. Instead, David left the ark at the nearby house of a man named Obed-Edom, who was from Gath. For 3 months, the ark stayed there. And during that time, God blessed Obed-Edom and his entire household in amazing ways. When David heard about these blessings, he realized that his fear had been wrong. God wasn't angry about the ark coming to Jerusalem. He had been angry about the wrong way they were transporting it. David studied the law and discovered that God had given specific instructions about how the ark should be moved. It was supposed to be carried on poles by the Levites, not transported on a cart. When David organized the second attempt to bring the ark to Jerusalem, he made sure everything was done exactly according to God's commands. This time, the Levites carried the ark properly, and David offered sacrifices every 6 steps of the journey. The celebration was even greater than before, with music and shouting and dancing that could be heard for miles around. David himself joined in the celebration with all his heart. In verse 14, we read that David, wearing a linen ephod, danced before the Lord with all his might. The king of Israel stripped down to a simple priest's garment and danced before God like a common worshiper. He didn't care about royal dignity or what people might think. He was so happy to have God's presence in his capital city that he celebrated with complete abandon. But not everyone appreciated David's enthusiastic worship. His wife Michal, Saul's daughter, was watching from a palace window, and she was embarrassed by her husband's behavior. She thought the king was acting beneath his station by dancing so freely in front of all the people. When David came home after the celebration, Michal confronted him with sarcasm and scorn. In verse 20, she said, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would." But David's response showed that his heart belonged completely to God, not to human opinion. In verses 21 to 22, David replied, "It was before the Lord, who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house, when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor." Because of Michal's bitter attitude toward David's worship, she never had children, and the royal line would not continue through Saul's family. With the ark safely in Jerusalem and his kingdom finally united and at peace, David began thinking about building a permanent temple for God. It troubled him that he was living in a beautiful palace made of cedar wood, while the ark of God was housed in nothing more than a tent. David shared his concern with Nathan the prophet, explaining his desire to build a house worthy of the Lord. Nathan's first response was encouraging. In 2 Samuel 7:3, the prophet told David, "Go, do all that you have in mind, for the Lord is with you." But that night, God spoke to Nathan with a message that would change everything, not just for David, but for all of human history. God's message began by reminding David that he had never asked for a house made of stone and cedar. In verses 6 through 7, God said through Nathan, "I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this day. I have been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling. Wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of their rulers, whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, 'Why have you not built me a house of cedar?'" But then God's message took an amazing turn. Instead of David building a house for God, God was going to build a house, a dynasty for David. In verses 11 to 12, God promised, "The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom." This promise was about David's immediate heir, but it was also about something much bigger. God continued in verses 13 to 16, "He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." This was the most important promise in all of Scripture up to that point. God was establishing an eternal covenant with David that would never be broken. David's descendant would sit on his throne forever, and God's love would never be taken away from his family line as it had been from Saul's family. David was overwhelmed by this incredible promise. He went into the tent where the ark was kept and poured out his heart to God in prayer. In verse 18, David said, "Who am I, sovereign Lord, and what is my family, that you have brought me this far?" David remembered that he was just a shepherd boy from Bethlehem, the youngest son who had been forgotten by his own father. How could God make such amazing promises to someone like him? But David understood that this covenant wasn't really about him. It was about God's plan for all humanity. In verse 19, David prayed, "And as if this were not enough in your sight, sovereign Lord, you have also spoken about the future of the house of your servant. And this is instruction for mankind, sovereign Lord." David realized that God's promise pointed to something far greater than any earthly kingdom. This covenant would ultimately be fulfilled in Jesus Christ, the Son of David, who would reign forever on David's throne. Through this promise, God was revealing his plan to send a Savior who would establish an eternal kingdom of peace and righteousness. The covenant with David became the foundation for all of Israel's hope for the future. Every time they faced defeat or exile or trouble, they could remember God's promise that David's throne would be established forever. It was a light shining in the darkness, pointing toward the day when the perfect king would come to rule with justice and mercy. With God's covenant promise giving him confidence and Jerusalem established as his strong capital, David began a series of military campaigns that would make Israel the most powerful nation in the region. His first target was the Philistines, the same people who had been Israel's greatest enemy for generations and who had killed Saul and Jonathan. David's strategy was different from Saul's defensive approach. Instead of waiting for the Philistines to attack, David took the fight to them. In 2 Samuel 8:1, we read that David defeated the Philistines and subdued them, and he took Metheg-Ammah from the control of the Philistines. This victory was so complete that the Philistines never again posed a serious threat to Israel during David's reign. Next, David turned his attention to the Moabites, the descendants of Lot who lived east of the Dead Sea. The Moabites had been allies of David during his time as a fugitive. He had even sent his parents to live with the king of Moab for their safety. But something had happened to change that relationship. And now the Moabites were enemies who needed to be defeated. David's victory over Moab was swift and decisive. In verse 2, Scripture records, David also defeated the Moabites. He made them lie down on the ground and measured them off with a length of cord. Every 2 lengths of them were put to death, and the 3rd length was allowed to live. So the Moabites became subject to David and brought him tribute. David's conquests continued as he defeated Hadadezer, the king of Zobah, who controlled a large area north of Israel. This victory was particularly significant because it brought David into conflict with the powerful Aramean kingdoms. When other Aramean cities sent troops to help Hadadezer, David defeated them all. In verse 6, we learn that David put garrisons in the Aramean kingdom of Damascus, and the Arameans became subject to him and brought tribute. The wealth that flowed into Israel from these conquests was staggering. David captured gold shields, bronze weapons, and huge amounts of silver and gold that he dedicated to the Lord. These treasures would later be used by his son Solomon to build the magnificent temple that David himself had dreamed of constructing. David's military genius was evident in every campaign. He understood that controlling key trade routes and strategic cities would give him power over entire regions. He established garrisons in conquered territories to maintain control and ensure the flow of tribute. Most importantly, he showed mercy to defeated enemies who submitted to his rule, which encouraged other nations to surrender rather than fight hopeless battles. The Edomites learned this lesson when David's forces defeated them in the Valley of Salt. In verse 14, we read that David put garrisons throughout Edom, and all the Edomites became subject to him. The Edomites, who were descendants of Esau and traditional enemies of Israel, found themselves serving the nation they had once despised. David's empire now stretched from Egypt to the Euphrates River, exactly as God had promised to Abraham hundreds of years earlier. Israel controlled the major trade routes between Africa, Asia, and Europe, making it incredibly wealthy and powerful. Nations that had once looked down on the Israelites now sent ambassadors to Jerusalem seeking David's favor. But David never forgot that his victories came from God, not from his own strength or wisdom. After each conquest, he dedicated the spoils to the Lord and gave credit to God for his success. In verse 6, the Bible emphasizes this truth. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. David also established a just government for his expanded kingdom. He appointed capable administrators to oversee different regions and made sure that justice was available to all his subjects, not just the Israelites. His reputation for fair dealing made even his enemies respect him and helped maintain peace throughout the empire. At the height of his power and success, David made the worst decision of his life. It happened during the spring season when kings normally went out to war with their armies. But this particular year, David decided to stay home in Jerusalem while his general Joab led the troops against the Ammonites. One evening, David was walking on the roof of his palace when he saw something that would change everything. A woman was bathing on the roof of a nearby house, and she was incredibly beautiful. Instead of looking away and going back inside, David kept watching. Then he made his first bad choice. He sent servants to find out who she was. The servants brought back information that should have stopped David immediately. In 2 Samuel 11:3, they reported, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." This woman was married, and not just to anyone. She was the wife of one of David's most loyal soldiers, who was currently away fighting for his king. But David was already too deep in temptation to stop. He sent messengers to bring Bathsheba to the palace. The Bible doesn't tell us whether she came willingly or whether she felt she had no choice but to obey the king's summons. What it does tell us in verse 4 is simple and devastating. Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Bathsheba then returned to her house, probably hoping that this terrible mistake could be forgotten and her life could return to normal. But a few weeks later, she sent David a message that turned his sin into a crisis. "I am pregnant." David's reaction shows how sin leads to more sin when we try to cover it up instead of confessing it. His first plan was to bring Uriah home from the battlefield and get him to sleep with his wife, so everyone would think the baby was Uriah's. David summoned Uriah back to Jerusalem under the pretense of wanting a report on how the war was going. After getting his report, David told Uriah to go home to his wife and rest. He even sent a gift of food from the royal table to Uriah's house. But Uriah was too loyal and too honorable to enjoy comfort while his fellow soldiers were sleeping on the ground in the field. Instead of going home, Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with David's servants. When David learned that Uriah hadn't gone home, he summoned him again. This time David got Uriah drunk, hoping that wine would overcome his sense of duty. But even drunk, Uriah refused to go to his house while the army was at war. David's first plan had failed completely, so he came up with something much worse. He wrote a letter to Joab with instructions to put Uriah in the most dangerous part of the next battle, and then withdraw the other troops, leaving Uriah to die. The most horrible part was that David sent this death sentence with Uriah himself, trusting in the man's loyalty to deliver his own execution order. Joab followed David's instructions. During the next battle with the Ammonites, he put Uriah at the front of the attack against the city wall, where the enemy's arrows would be most deadly. Then, at the crucial moment, Joab pulled back the supporting troops. Uriah and several other soldiers were killed, just as David had planned. When the messenger brought news of the battle casualties to David, he was told that Uriah the Hittite was among the dead. David's response to Joab, recorded in verse 25, was cold and calculated. Don't let this upset you. The sword devours one as well as another. Press the attack against the city and destroy it. After Bathsheba finished her period of mourning for her husband, David married her, and she gave birth to their son. To everyone else, it probably looked like the king had shown mercy to a war widow by marrying her. But God knew exactly what had really happened. The final verse of 2 Samuel 11 contains some of the most frightening words in the entire Bible. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. The man after God's own heart had committed adultery and murder, and God was not going to let it pass without consequences. For almost a year, David lived with his secret sin. He had successfully covered up his adultery and murder, and no one suspected what he had really done. He continued ruling the kingdom, leading worship, and acting like the godly king everyone thought he was. But inside, his soul was being destroyed by guilt and the weight of his unconfessed sin. Then one day, Nathan the prophet came to visit the king. Nathan had been God's messenger when he made the eternal covenant with David, so David was always happy to see him. But this visit would be very different from their previous meetings. Nathan told David a story about two men who lived in the same town. In 2 Samuel 12, 1-4, Nathan said, "There were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle. But the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for his guest. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him." David's reaction was immediate and furious. His sense of justice was outraged by this story of a rich man stealing from someone who had almost nothing. In verse 5, David declared, "As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over. because he did such a thing and had no pity. That's when Nathan delivered the words that shattered David's world. "You are the man." The prophet explained that God had given David everything: the kingdom, wealth, wives, and success. But David had taken the one precious thing that belonged to his loyal soldier, Uriah. Nathan continued with God's judgment in verses 9 through 10. "Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own." The consequences would be severe and public. God said that trouble would come from David's own family, and that his wives would be given to another in broad daylight for all Israel to see. The sin David had committed in secret would be punished openly. But David's response showed why he was truly a man after God's own heart. Instead of making excuses, denying the charges, or trying to justify his actions, David immediately confessed. In verse 13, David said to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." Nathan's response brought both judgment and mercy. "The Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. But because by doing this you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die." Soon after Nathan left, David and Bathsheba's baby became very sick. David fasted and prayed desperately for 7 days, hoping God would heal the child. He lay on the ground all night, refusing food and begging God to spare his son's life. But on the 7th day, the baby died. David's servants were afraid to tell him the news, thinking he might do something drastic. But when David realized the child was dead, he surprised everyone. He got up, washed himself, put on clean clothes, and went to worship God. Then he came home and asked for food. When his servants asked why he was no longer mourning, David explained in verses 22 to 23, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me." David's repentance was complete and genuine. He wrote Psalm 51 during this time, one of the most beautiful prayers of confession ever written. In it, he cried out to God, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin." God did forgive David, but the consequences of his sin would follow him for the rest of his life. The sword would never depart from his house, and trouble would come from his own children in ways that would break his heart over and over again. The troubles that Nathan predicted for David's family began to unfold in the most painful ways possible. David had many wives and children, but he struggled to be a good father to them. Perhaps because his own father had overlooked him, David found it hard to discipline his sons or provide them with proper guidance. The first crisis involved 2 of David's children from different mothers. Amnon was David's oldest son, heir to the throne, and seemingly a young man with a bright future. But Amnon developed an unhealthy obsession with his half-sister Tamar, who was the full sister of another of David's sons, Absalom. Amnon's friend Jonadab gave him evil advice on how to get Tamar alone. Amnon pretended to be sick and asked David to send Tamar to make food for him and feed him personally. David, not suspecting any danger, sent his daughter to take care of her half-brother. When Tamar came to Amnon's house and prepared food for him, he sent all the servants away. Then, in 2 Samuel 13:11, he grabbed her and said, "Come to bed with me, my sister." Tamar pleaded with him not to do such a wicked thing, suggesting that he could ask their father to let them marry if he truly loved her. But Amnon refused to listen. In verses 14 to 15, the Bible records the terrible outcome. But he refused to listen to her, and since he was stronger than she, he raped her. Then Amnon hated her with intense hatred. In fact, he hated her more than he had loved her. After destroying his sister's life, Amnon threw her out of his house like garbage. Tamar was devastated. She tore her beautiful robe, put ashes on her head, and went away crying loudly. When Absalom found her and learned what had happened, he was filled with rage against Amnon. He took Tamar to live in his house and told her to keep quiet about what had happened. When David heard about the rape, he was furious, but he did nothing to punish Amnon. Perhaps because Amnon was his firstborn and heir, or perhaps because David remembered his own failures with Bathsheba. The king failed to act. This lack of justice from their father drove Absalom to take matters into his own hands. For 2 years, Absalom nursed his hatred and planned his revenge. Finally, during the annual sheep shearing celebration, Absalom invited all his brothers to a feast. When Amnon was relaxed and happy from drinking wine, Absalom gave the signal to his men, and they killed Amnon as he sat at the table. All of David's other sons fled in terror, thinking Absalom was planning to kill them all to clear his path to the throne. David was heartbroken when he heard that Amnon was dead and that Absalom had fled to his grandfather's kingdom. For 3 years, Absalom lived in exile, while David mourned for both sons, the one who was dead and the one who was lost to him. Eventually, through Joab's intervention, David allowed Absalom to return to Jerusalem, but he refused to see him. For 2 more years, father and son lived in the same city without speaking. This continued rejection filled Absalom with bitterness against his father and ambition for his throne. Absalom began plotting rebellion. He was incredibly handsome and charming, and he used these gifts to win the hearts of the people. In 2 Samuel 15:2-6, the Bible describes his strategy. Absalom would get up early and stand by the side of the road leading to the city gate. Whenever anyone came with a complaint to be placed before the king for a decision, Absalom would call out to him, "What town are you from?" He would answer, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." Then Absalom would say to him, "Look, your claims are valid and proper, but there is no representative of the king to hear you." And Absalom would add, "If only I were appointed judge in the land. Then everyone who has a complaint or case could come to me, and I would see that they receive justice." Also, whenever anyone approached him to bow down before him, Absalom would reach out his hand, take hold of him, and kiss him. Absalom behaved in this way toward all the Israelites who came to the king for justice, and so he stole the hearts of the people of Israel. After 4 years of this careful preparation, Absalom was ready to make his move. He asked David's permission to go to Hebron to fulfill a vow he had made while in exile. David gave his blessing, not knowing that Absalom was actually going there to declare himself king. From Hebron, the same city where David had been crowned king of Judah, Absalom sent secret messengers throughout Israel announcing his rebellion. When David heard that the hearts of the people of Israel are with Absalom, he knew he had to flee immediately or face a siege in Jerusalem. David left Jerusalem with his household and loyal followers, weeping as he climbed the Mount of Olives. The man who had conquered mighty enemies and built a great empire was being driven from his own capital by his own son. The consequences of his sin with Bathsheba were now tearing his family and kingdom apart, just as Nathan had predicted years before. If this story has touched your heart and strengthened your faith, Please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you won't miss any of our biblical stories. Share this video with friends and family who need to hear about God's faithfulness and grace. Your support helps us continue bringing these life-changing stories to people around the world. What moment from David's life impacted you the most? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, remember that no matter where you are in your journey, God sees your heart, and His plans for you are always good.